And joining us now on the debate for the full hour tonight, Hussein Ibish, Senior Fellow at the American Task Force on Palestine and the proprietor of IbishBlog.com. Derek Pinsler, Professor of Jewish History at the University of Toronto. Mohammed Fadl, Professor in the Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto. And Janice Stein, TVO's Foreign Affairs Analyst and Director of the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. Boy, if we got a U of T dream team here tonight. How about that?
Well, we're a dream university.
No argument for me, ma'am. I graduated from there. Hussein, first of all, welcome to you. Thanks for making the trip up from Washington. It was good of you. Janice, putting you to work first here. What do we know about who was the driving force behind the scenes in getting Fatah and Hamas to actually make this agreement?
Well, the Egyptians opened it up again. Of course, there's a long history of Egypt trying to do this without great success, and they brought it back to the table. But I think what's really important here is what's happening in the broader Arab world. For Fatah, as you've just said, that secure relationship with Hosni Mubarak is gone. And for Hamas, they are looking north, and they've been under tremendous pressure from the Assad government. The Assad government asked them to declare their loyalty to his regime. They refused. Their leader lives in Damascus. One of their leaders lives in Damascus. So there's a sense of vulnerability now, which is very real, and I think was instrumental in bringing Hamas back to the table. One other little thing, there were actually some small demonstrations in both Ramallah and in Gaza City.
Against the agreement?
Well, no, against both regimes individually, calling for the unification of the two sides. And I think that got everybody's attention.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Hussein, this seemed to come out of nowhere. Did it catch you off guard?
The Hamas change of heart certainly did. I think it caught everybody off guard, probably including President Abbas, who appears to have been unprepared for a sudden yes. He was pushing for this for several weeks. He was saying he would go to Gaza to deal with it, and certainly the Egyptians were moving the ball forward. You could see momentum building towards it, but it was a very sudden shift, and it does seem to correlate to that moment in Syria where when the Muslim Brotherhood basically declared themselves at dagger points with the Assad regime, and the Assad regime made demands on Hamas. Hamas was unable to fulfill them, being a Muslim Brotherhood party, and their situation there became untenable. So I think that's, you know, that at that point, it shouldn't have surprised anyone, but it happened so quickly. It sort of did, yes.
Mohammed, polls show 54% of Egyptians are against the Camp David Agreement, which, as we know, has been in place since 1978-79. To what extent do you think that number was responsible for the Egyptian military government's involvement in mediating this deal?
I can't draw any causal links. Actually, I'm surprised it's only 54%.
I think it should be higher.
I would think it would probably be higher, at least based on the things that I've read. Amr Moussa, for example, said that, you know, you should stop talking about the 1979 Camp David Accords and just refer to the 2002 Arab peace plan, that represents Egypt's official foreign policy. I think some of the things that I had read was that with the regime change in Egypt, Hamas had lost some of its suspicion of the Egyptian government and made it a lot more willing to trust Egyptian mediation. That may have been an important causal factor as well.
Derek, did this catch you off guard?
Well, I think in the long run, it's one of these things we like to follow the Soviet Union in retrospect. We say, well, it had to happen because there couldn't possibly be a declaration of Palestinian statehood that's going to have any kind of lasting significance unless it involves both Hamas and Fatah.
They seem such polar opposites, though, on so many things.
They do seem polar opposites, and yet, after all, Hamas won the popular election, and in a way, Fatah's ongoing rule has been illegitimate. And so this kind of reconciliation, as opposed as the parties might be, it really is a necessary, if insufficient, precondition for Palestinian statehood.
Well, if I may, there were two elections, actually. There was a presidential election in 2005 that was won by President Abbas with about 62% of the vote, and then a parliamentary election 1 year after, in January of 2006, that Hamas-backed candidates got about 44% of the vote, and a parliamentary majority. So they both had legitimacy, and one legitimate claim on the executive, the other legitimate claim on the legislature. All terms have expired. So in terms of voting, no one has any legitimacy anymore. So just wanted to clarify that.
Pick up on this, though, Hussein.
Yeah.
I'm going to go with another poll here. Fatah has the support, if you ask Palestinians, where does your support lie? 40% with Fatah, Hamas 6%, 48% didn't trust either.
Yeah.
Does that speak volumes in this case?
It does, and this sort of figure, you can get many different figures, but that range is consistent throughout almost all the polls over the past couple of years. Yes, certainly all Palestinians are skeptical of all of their political parties, and the only way to get good numbers for Fatah is to ask them in comparison to Hamas, and then suddenly their numbers shoot up. But there is tremendous skepticism about both. I think Hamas has proven itself to be misrulers in Gaza, and their policies towards Israel and the world are frankly dysfunctional, and they don't serve the Palestinian national interest, and I think that's completely obvious. The PLO and Fatah have failed diplomatically. They have failed to advance the cause of Palestinian independence at the diplomatic register in a meaningful way. Yes,
you don't think it's closer today than it's been?
Well, in very minor ways, in the sense that they're setting up something in September, but again, it will be symbolic. It won't change the strategic equation on the ground. Yes, they've gotten a bunch of recognitions in South America and mission upgrades in the West, and it's all positive, but there's nothing that's changed the fundamental reality, with this exception, which is the PA led by Prime Minister Fayyad, who is not a member of Fatah and not an official of the PLO, have had significant success in building Palestinian institutions in the parts of the West Bank that he has been able to control. Okay. And that has given some degree of credibility to the overall sort of PLO umbrella, even though he's not part of it.
Janice, I want to read a quote to you from Jimmy Carter. We talked about the Camp David Accords. He was the architect of those, of course, and I had the pleasure of seeing him actually a couple of weekends ago in Atlanta, and Plains rather, and he said this: suspicions of Hamas stem from its charter, which call for Israel's destruction. I find the charter repugnant. Yet it is worth remembering that Israel negotiated the Oslo Accords with the Palestine Liberation Organization, while its charter had similar provisions. It took 5 more years before the PLO charter was altered. I remember asking President Carter when we saw each other down in Plains whether this reconciliation, he thought, moved the yardsticks forward, and he very much did. He thought it was a big deal. The suggestion here is that with time, Hamas can be expected to moderate. Do you agree?
Well, I think that, first of all, I think the reconciliation is a big deal. And it is very, very important in Palestinian politics. 2, it's not a done deal. And so we might want to come back to that, but there are lots of things that could pull this apart as the Palestinian national movement moves through the next year, which is a problematic year. Thirdly, could Hamas moderate? Of course it could moderate, and you're actually seeing some signs. You had Mashal making statements in the last week. We will accept a 2-state solution within the borders of 1967, with Jerusalem as the capital of the Palestinian state, and an absolute right of return for Palestinian refugees to come back to Israel. And so the interviewer then said to him, well, will that be the end of the conflict? He said, I don't want to talk about that. We don't ask Israelis whether they think it's the end of the conflict, so don't ask me that question. Is this an end to violence?
That's certainly something short of we're going to drive all the Israelis into the sea.
For him, this is certainly a major signal that he is giving, and if people are paying attention, there is an opportunity here. The bigger question to me is this going to stick?
Yeah. Slight correction, if I might. What Mishal said is similar to that. He said he would accept a Palestinian state in the 67 borders. He did not agree to a 2-state solution. He specifically declined to answer the question about whether he would recognize Israel or not. So that's a big difference. And if Carter thinks the PLO charter, even the 64, even the most hardcore one, bears any resemblance to the Hamas charter, he can't read.
Well, there was something similar happening within al-Fatah, it was actually within some other Palestinian factions. In the early 1970s, they began to talk about a provisional authority and about statehood within the occupied territories. And this was a kind of a very gradual, early groping towards recognition of Israel. And you can argue for maybe not a direct line, but a kind of an irregular process that eventually leads 20 years later, right? Or towards recognition of Israel. So there does seem to be a process of moderation going on.
I think it's a signal. I think the fairest thing to say about that statement from Shal, it's a signal, and it's designed to get people.
What?
Well, it's a signal to say if all this works and there's some receptivity on Israel's side, there's room to talk here. But I'm not going to talk. I'm going to leave that to President Abbas.
The problem is there were other signs going on at the same time. Haniya denouncing the murder of bin Laden and praising him as a holy warrior was not a great sign.
Doesn't help.
And Mahmoud Zahar, the former foreign minister, saying we'll absolutely never recognize Israel, etc. So Hamas has a quite a long history in recent years of saying different things to different audiences, and it's strategic. But I completely agree with you. What is being put out there by Mishala and others is that if it is in their interest to do it, there is a potential of breaking with their ideology. Whether that, the extent to which that can be realized is untested. Maybe
Mohammed,
it should be tested.
Let me ask you this, Mohammed, because one of the things President Carter also said was, yes, the reconciliation between these two Arab groups is a positive thing in terms of the potential of Palestine becoming a real state. But he also said as long as Benjamin Netanyahu is Prime Minister of Israel, there's not much hope for progress.
Yeah,
what do you think on
actually,
that?
that's a good segue to the point that I wanted to make. I think it's really unrealistic to believe in the prospects for genuine Israeli-Palestinian reconciliation until we look at the positions of both sides. Yeah. We have to try to get both sides to a position where there's genuine mutual recognition of the rights of other peoples, first as individuals, and then figure out how collectively they can live together as equals respectfully. To the extent that you still have sort of maximalist Zionist demands on Palestinians, of course Hamas will never moderate, and will never moderate because it has no cost in not moderating.
Derek, let me put this to you. Here's Tom Friedman of the New York Times just from yesterday. For the last 30 years, Israel enjoyed peace with Egypt wholesale by having peace with just one man, Hosni Mubarak. That sale is over. Today, post-Mubarak, to sustain the peace treaty with Egypt in any kind of stable manner, Israel is going to have to pay retail. It is going to have to make peace with 85 million Egyptians. The days in which one phone call by Israel to Mubarak could shut down any crisis in relations are over. Let's get some discussion going on this. Are Egyptians or Palestinians open to Israeli retail politics?
Well, I don't know what those politics would look like, because right now the state of Israel kind of is like a wholesale market where you have the prime minister who's constantly negotiating between all kinds of, as it were, haggling merchants representing the different political interests. And although it's fashionable to critique Netanyahu for his ineffectuality, he's actually quite successful at staying on top of all of this. The creeping settlement, for example, the gradual growth of settlement in the West Bank, the lack of movement on the peace process, all of this really seems to conform with a kind of general consensus of what the Israeli body politic wants. Anything more radical in either direction, and he would probably be out of a job. So it's not just a question of critiquing Netanyahu, but it's a kind of a paralysis in Israeli society as a whole.
James,
well, I'm not so sure. From two perspectives. One, from the domestic politics perspective, secondly, from international. Let's just go back to the previous Prime Minister, Olmert. It was not, and that was a far more forthcoming negotiation that was going on between Olmert and Abbas that, had it succeeded, would really have moved the yardsticks. He did not lose his job over that issue. Right. He lost his job over good old-fashioned graft and corruption. And that's why he lost control of his coalition. So I actually have a different view of the Israeli body politic. There's a history in Israel of the public following the leader, and it's up to the leader to move the yardstick. The second wild card here is just before the Hamas-Fatah agreement, there was wide-ranging speculation, let me put it that way, that President Obama was about to put some parameters on the table. Now, there's no question what they would be. They would be far closer to Abbas's position than they would be to Netanyahu. Pressure was then building inside Netanyahu's coalition for him to preempt. Those pressures are still there, and September 2011 is still there. So I actually think that there is some movement in both capitals, because if not, they cede the political territory.
I think I agree more with you, honestly. Even though everything you said is right, one thing that has to be recognized is that Israel's body politic, Israel's polity is changing. It's not static, it's actually transforming. The growth in the ultra-Orthodox community and their increasing politicization has driven the country to the right, and the organization of the Russian emigre community, which is much stronger now than it was during the Olmert years, producing the Israel Beitenu party and Foreign Minister Lieberman, who may be the most anti-peace force in the cabinet. a cabinet which is split, as the Palestinians were split into two camps. The Israeli cabinet is split into three camps. You've got the Barak camp, which says that there's nothing more important than a peace agreement, and Iranian nuclear weapons are utterly secondary, and Israel has no option but to have a peace agreement with the Palestinians, existential necessity. The camp led by Lieberman, but probably including Yishai and the other ultra-Orthodox Shas members, as well as his own followers, and Netanyahu's faction, which is sort of makes a habit of being ambiguous about the whole thing, because precisely he's triangulating within Israeli politics and between his right and the White House and the American national interest. He's very skillful at that. He's a good politician, but it's actually, a lot of it is stymieing progress on peace in order to maintain his position.
Mohammed.
Yeah, if I could just follow up on that, I think it's very important to recognize, as Hussein said, that the Israeli body politic is not static. But one thing that I would want to caution against is a belief that its natural tendencies to become more and more right. I personally, I believe, like in my lifetime, it has become more and more right wing, but it's not because there's something naturally inherent to Israeli society to do that. But I think part of the reason, or the main reason, in fact, is that it pays no costs for going further and further to the right. As long as the United States continues to subsidize occupation, settlements, etc., without any kind of penalty, then domestically in Israel, there's no cost to pay for supporting these policies.
Except that the Israelis at the moment widely perceive President Obama not to be in their corner. I think there's
it's hard to imagine what
well, hang on. Obama's got 3% support, popularity support in Israel.
But Steve,
I mean, what does that tell you?
But that doesn't take President Obama off the agenda. It doesn't matter whether the Israeli public perceives him as pro-Israel or not. You could argue it takes him off the agenda until the next U.S. presidential election. Right? That's entirely conceivable. But after that is the historic time when a U.S. president moves in the first year of your second term, when you're liberated from some of these. And when you combine that with a prospect that across the Israeli political spectrum they are dreading, which is the declaration by the United Nations of an independent Palestinian state, there is a sense for the first time, even among the right-wing coalition, that simply status quo, not moving, will impose political costs.
I want to pick up on that notion of the United Nations vote, which you just talked about. And in fact, there is the prospect of a vote this fall in the UN that might create a Palestinian state. And Derek, I want to bring you in on this.
Create is probably the wrong word.
Yeah,
declare.
Definitely.
Declare.
Create is definitely the wrong word.
Okay, declare.
Recognize.
Recognize is technically
I
the
love when
correct
we
word.
have consensus. Okay, let's use that word instead. What do you make of the irony that it was a vote of the United Nations that created Israel once upon, I guess, 63 years ago tomorrow, and it might be a vote of the UN that recognizes a Palestinian state all these years later?
Well, don't forget East Timor. There are a couple of other historic examples. There you go. Look, it's very similar in that Israel was not created by the UN. There was a kind of a mini-state that had been developed over 60 years of very hard work, constructive and diplomatic work. And I often ask myself, what would have happened if the United Nations resolution had failed back in 1947? Would a state of Israel never have been created? Would there not have been conflict, armed conflict between Palestinians and Jews in Palestine? The state of Israel might have emerged anyway, even without that successful UN vote. But it did take that form. And the same thing here, where if and when there's a state of Palestine, it will not be because of the good graces of the UN. It'll be because of many decades of diplomatic and political and also military
Let me
effort.
correct myself. Stand by. Let me correct myself, because I think I said the vote is 63. Israel declared independence 63 years ago tomorrow. The vote in the UN was in November, the previous November.
Just on this point, because I think it brings up, and I'd really be interested to hear what Hussein has to say about this. To follow on Derek's point, Palestine has had a really extraordinary, technocratic, apolitical Prime Minister Fayyad, who is not a member of the PLO or of Hamas, who has made it his business to build Palestinian institutions over the last years. This is probably the best strategist that Palestine has had, because he said, I'm not interested, I'm giving up on Israel, I'm not interested in what Israel's doing. We're going to put in place institutions. And he's led the drive to September. One of the big political unknowns is when Hamas and the PLO now come together in this national unity government, does Fayyad retain his prime ministership? He has been absolutely instrumental in getting World Bank approval, World Bank recognition that Palestine is a viable state. What's his political future?
Okay.
No, absolutely no idea. This is one of the many unanswerable, imponderable questions. The news reports suggest that President Abbas would like to keep him in power. Hamas would not like him in power. But it's very, even if he were to be offered to stay on, what kind of authority would he really have under the current circumstances? Would he be able to continue with the state building program? It's all very up in the air. We don't know. And we don't know what he will say. So, I mean, I agree completely. This has been the main source of momentum towards actual practical Palestinian independence over the past couple of years, not diplomacy.
Try this one. Mahmoud Abbas has said, I think it's accurate to say, he has preferred a negotiated settlement with Israel to achieve a Palestinian state as opposed to a vote of the United Nations.
Yes.
Why would he prefer that?
Well, and in fact, it's noteworthy. It really should be recognized by people that he has said several times that they will forego any action in the UN in September if they get serious negotiations with Israel started again, predicated on a settlement freeze. So they're really very serious about this, and I think it needs to be recognized that the PLO and all the Palestinian moderates have sort of doubled and tripled and quadrupled down on a negotiated agreement.
Why? Why is that the better way to go?
Because they realize that in the end, there is no other way to establish the state other than through a negotiated agreement. It cannot be imposed on the Israelis. In the foreseeable future, there is no way to coerce or force Palestinian statehood on the Israelis. That you can have all the recognitions you want in South America and at the UN and what have you. In the end, there's only one state's recognition or acquiescence or agreement that is crucial. Israel and to some extent the United States. Now, the state building, the importance of the state building program was that it was creating the state on the ground as a reality. It was the Palestinian answer to settlement building. It was unilateral, it was constructive, and unlike settlement building, it was lawful and consistent with the stated goals of all parties to create a Palestinian state. So it was really a brilliant strategy. And
Derek is a historian here. I should not speak for him, but he would probably tell you it's not dissimilar from the strategy that the Jews used from 1920 to 1948.
Fayyad has said so many times. But here's the thing that Fayyad and also Abbas and others have said, which is that this state building program is not a development program. It's not an economic program. It's a political and strategic program, and it has to lead to independence, or they will scrap it.
Well, let's try this. You have been following this file, all of you collectively, for a very long time, and we know that there are, I guess, 4 key obstacles to all of this happening. Permanent status of borders, permanent status of settlements, permanent status of Jerusalem/East Jerusalem, refugees. Let's go around on this. Mohammed, which is the toughest of those nuts to crack?
Refugees.
Right.
Refugees is the hardest. Because
all
what?
agree.
You all agree on
We all
that?
agree.
I think refugees and Jerusalem. No. I think they are the
stand by.
pills.
Let's pull this apart then.
Yeah.
Refugees is the toughest one to get a resolution on because why?
Those are real people. I think, as much as Muslims love Jerusalem, at the end of the day, if the refugees are treated respectfully, I think there can be negotiated some kind of shared condominium around Jerusalem. It's just a piece of land. Right. As long as there's trust, there's a way to resolve it. The problem with the refugees is not only are there really, there are lots of them, right? But it goes to really deep, visceral questions of identity on both sides. And I think there's a reluctance to face those difficult questions.
The problem on Jerusalem is not on the Arab or the Muslim side. It's going to be on the Israeli side. There is an analogy here between the two things, not insofar as, I agree with you, there's a distinction between a piece of land that can be negotiated over people's lives. But where I see a symmetry or a parallel, an analogy, is that these are politically the most difficult things for the two sets of leaderships to sell to their people. And here I see them as actually necessary reciprocal concessions.
See, I don't agree. I agree with Mohammed.
Okay.
I think the refugee issue is the most difficult issue because there hasn't really been an honest conversation inside each community about this. And the only time that we've actually come close twice really, to a final agreement. What actually happens, we have some evidence, is on the Israeli side, there was a willingness to trade off Jerusalem in exchange for a solution to the refugee problem, which did allow for respect, stopped short of an apology, but acknowledged the suffering of the Palestinian people, but then set a hard number on the number of Palestinian refugees who could return to Israel. And it was no coincidence that in Mashal's statement, that's the issue he really put his finger on. He said it is essential there be no compromise on the number of refugees who could return to Israel. That's the toughest one.
Yeah, but that's different.
We need to hear Derek.
Sorry.
There's also, they say at the University of Chicago that's all very well and good in practice, but how is it in theory? There are symbolic dimensions to the refugee issue that are so powerful. The very nature of the Palestinian Nakba, right? The Palestinian catastrophe in 1948 is tied up with the refugee issue. The question of whether there will be a two-state solution or a one-state solution, if the right of return were to be realized in all of its in its maximum form, and the demand that Netanyahu has made that Israel be recognized as a Jewish state is all based on a desire to really get around a possible demand for a right of return. That is, the right of return is not simply a practical issue. Jerusalem can be divided up, borders can be set, settlements can be dismantled. But the right of return is, and it gets back to your very first point, Mohammed, about peace between equals. That without some kind of very careful finessing of the right of return, it is not a peace between equals.
Let me get Hussein on this, though. Hang on a second, because there's a bit of a backstory here that we need your help on.
Sure.
A few months ago, Al Jazeera revealed that there were secret Palestinian documents suggesting that Palestinian negotiators had agreed to allow a particular number of refugees back into Israel. I can't remember what it was at the moment. It was
there were
10,000? 100,000. As a result of this disclosure, Saeb Erekat, the chief negotiator, resigned.
No, it is not as a result of that disclosure. He resigned because of the leak itself. He resigned because his office was unable to maintain the security over those documents. And those documents are, it's a very interesting set of documents. They're mostly unsigned and undated. So it's not clear. It's a little bit like sitting in the corner of a room, overhearing one side of a phone call.
Okay, no, I understand
for a
that.
long time.
But I had heard that there was considerable criticism about the fact that he'd actually put on concrete terms the number 100,000.
There are several actually numbers in different documents, and sure, anytime anybody attaches a number, there will be a great deal of anger, because you're right, there hasn't been an honest conversation among Palestinians about the what sort of compromises on the refugee question will be necessary to make a peace agreement with Israel. In the same way, there really has not been an honest conversation among Israelis about the kinds of compromises that have to happen over Jerusalem in order to make.
Let's see if we can figure out some of that honest conversation. Would the Palestinian side acknowledge that an unfettered right of return by Palestinian Arabs to return to their former homes is just not on?
Depends who.
I mean, I think there are two different questions here. First is the theoretical question: was something wrong done to the Palestinian refugees when they were forced to leave? That's the first question. What happened? That's the first question. Second thing is, how do you remediate it, right? And I think if there can be some sort of consensus arrived at the first question, there's a lot of flexibility on the second. Now, part of the problem here is I've heard Israelis say, oh, they can have a right of return to the West Bank and Gaza. Now, I don't think that's an ideal solution, because there are, you know better than I, but 2 million Palestinian refugees or more in the neighboring countries.
Oh, much more.
Now, if they were to come back to the West Bank, that's going to be catastrophic, right? And so there's got to be a coordinated solution involving all countries in the region. But that's the other thing that Hussein is getting to. I don't believe that most refugees would want to go back, but they do want recognition.
We actually have some evidence, which is wonderful, right? That we actually know something about this. And this work has been done now for 15 years by Khalil Shikaki, who does who is one of the outstanding Palestinian pollsters who's gone back and back and back into the refugee community. So what do we know, right, in terms of refugee attitudes? His data show, depending on when you ask, and there's some variation, but that no more, he says, there is no more than 500,000 Palestinian refugees. That's the absolute maximum who would actually want to come back. The rest expect compensation. And that number drops, depending on the time period you're looking at, to 250,000 to 500,000. That's the variance.
Is it beyond compensation, though? Is it a recognition that something was lost in some?
So
and
that Mohammed's other point, that's
Yeah.
very, very important.
Yeah.
And there's been extensive negotiations in every piece, in every so-called process, both the informal ones that have been done by Palestinian and Israelis together and the official ones. There is, I think, there's not much daylight here anymore. Interestingly, that's where there has been progress. The Israelis will have indicated that they would acknowledge that there was pain and suffering on the part of the Palestinians.
Let me be clear about this.
That doesn't fully meet the demand.
Let me be clear about this, and I'll get Hussein.
But that is forthcoming.
Get Hussein and then Derek in on this part of it. In a recent debate, the Israeli writer Yossi Klein Halevi said that the conditions for Israel's acceptance of culpability for creating Arab refugees is Arab acknowledgement that the War of 1948, Israelis call it their War of Independence, was aimed at exterminating the Jews.
Wow.
What's your view on that condition?
Well, I mean, I think it's being silly because it was not the intention of either the Palestinians in the civil war that began in late 1947 or the Arab armies. And this is about what kind of state would be created, whether a Jewish state would be created or not, or whether the Arab majority would have their way in Palestine or the Jewish minority would have its way in Palestine. And this is what the war was about.
Yeah.
No, but let me just say one thing about the refugee issue, if I might.
Well, is it on this? I don't want to lose the track of this
go
right
ahead.
here. Derek,
Yeah.
do you want to comment on this part here?
You know, this is a problem where we should never take political rhetoric seriously, no matter who it comes from. And if you listen to the broadcasts of Egyptian radio in 1948, you hear some things, but which have been repeated over and over again.
What would you have heard?
What you would have heard would have been the famous phrases that we will throw the Jews into the sea, and it was quite frightening. Absolutely frightening, and that kind of rhetoric was used in the Arab media and still is used to this day. But often the rhetoric is a weapon of people who don't have a whole lot of other kinds of power.
It was not the dominant rhetoric. You can find it if you go looking for it, but it is not. It was not the standard political line of the Arab states at the time.
What was not revealed, though,
it's very important.
In 48, I found it a hard time to believe that King Farouk is broadcasting messages like that. But I'd like to see.
No, it was the Arab League. It was coming from but that's not the issue. What was being hidden, and this only came out 15, 20 years ago in research, is that the Arab meetings in late 1947 determined that they didn't possibly have the military strength to prevent the rise of a Jewish state, and they were of course so divided among themselves as to what the purposes of the war would be. So it was a war to try to limit the power, the size, the nature of the Jewish state to try to force Israel, what would become Israel, back to the negotiating table.
It was also a war to preempt each other.
Yeah,
because they were fighting over
This is
There
what
were
it was.
large inter-Arab dynamics at that point,
absolutely.
Jordanian, Syrian, and Egyptian.
But Israelis didn't know that at the time.
No.
Okay.
No.
You wanted to make that other point.
I do. I agree with Mohammed that really there has to be a serious, more than acknowledgement of pain, an acknowledgement of some degree of responsibility, serious responsibility. Without this, it's going to be very, very hard to overcome the refugee issue. But I do think as a practical matter, it's implausible to expect, and I think all the Palestinian negotiators have recognized this since '93 and certainly since 2000, that it's implausible and unrealistic to expect the Israelis to agree to an unfettered right of return. So what's necessary is to separate the right from the return. The right exists. The right is not something that can actually be expunged from international law, but the implementation of the return can be negotiated in the context of the logic of two states. Right? This is exactly how it has to be
And
done.
then the argument becomes numbers.
The argument
And
becomes
that's
numbers.
what it is, informally in all
But
the
all kinds of
conversations.
different numbers. Number involving
Yes.
compensation, number
Yes.
involving return to Israel, number involving
Return to the region.
all kinds of different numbers. And there are some other things that Palestinian refugees would get under such circumstances, including a state to represent them, which they don't have right now, along with a refuge in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Now, I mean, I agree with you, this is very problematic, but there are Palestinian communities, particularly in Lebanon, who need rescuing.
Yes,
I mean,
I
this
agree.
is a matter
Yes.
of, it has been a matter of life and death, and it may again become one. And they live under conditions that could only be described as apartheid. It's a scandalous disgrace, and about 250,000 of them,
Mohammed,
and they need rescuing.
You wanted to make a
Yeah,
point.
I wanted to make one other point. I think what's also crucial to getting to the finish line is the future reciprocal relations between Palestine and Israel.
Yeah.
If you imagine a sort of two-state solution, which you have hermetically sealed borders, right? I don't think that's going to work, right? You have to have some kind of, I think, mutual relationship where the people on both sides can be productive and engage in cooperation among each other, and movement of people across borders, right? I mean, I think it's very unrealistic to think that you're going to have an Arab-free Israel and a Jewish-free Palestine.
Agreed.
And I think any kind of peace has to recognize that, and that the relationship between these two states has to go forward on a cooperative basis, not a separation basis.
You
Okay,
might have an Israeli government insisting that all of its citizens leave a sovereign Palestinian state initially, because they would not want to be responsible. I mean, if you think about who is likely to remain in what is likely to become Palestine, and who would not go and would refuse economic inducements and what have you. The residents of Kiryat Arba, for example, in Hebron. These are not people who are likely to have a happy relationship with their Palestinian neighbors.
Nor with their own governments.
And then, exactly, and then would the Israeli government really want the responsibility? I actually think it's very important that the Palestinians maintain their current position, the PLO position, that the settlers, that Jews can remain in Palestine, but not as settlers. But I think the Israeli government is likely to decline that.
It's exactly this kind of discussion. I think you're right, Mohammed. Over the long term, what you want
I agree.
is open borders and capacity for people to move. Frankly, practically speaking, in the short term, there's a passage to go through in which
trust has to be established.
That's right,
Exactly
and there will be some process of separation and people moving. In order, really, and there has to be a sense, because this territory is so small, both sides, and the capacity to wreak havoc on both sides is so large that there will be, in fact, I think, were this ever to come to pass, there will be some separation.
Okay, let me jump in here. Forgive me, we're going to get caught on time here, and I want to make sure we've got time for our last segment of our discussion, which we're calling Dr. Freud. We want to talk about the emotions of all of this, and we're going to quote Brother Penzler from something he wrote in Invention of the Jewish People. Michael Smith, if you would. Israel has completed a long-standing process of transformation into a highly individualistic consumer society, and with the exception of the radical right, it had lost the sense participating in a heroic political venture. Israelis are increasingly alienated from their own history. Ongoing conflict with the Palestinians and hostile global public opinion has encouraged retreat into the panic room of Jewish peoplehood. The state of Israel, which its founders hoped would be fundamentally different from the diaspora, is now seen as its extension, no less threatened, no less unjustly maligned. Assuming, as many Israeli Jews do, that the Arab foe is implacable, it does not matter to them if Israel was the aggressor in this or any other circumstance, as the only alternative to aggression is destruction. Okay, Derek, let's start with this. I think we need you to elaborate on this notion of the panic room of Jewish peoplehood. What does that mean?
I should say, I did not write The Invention of the Jewish People. That's a book by Shlomo Zahn that I critiqued.
You critiqued, okay, forgive me.
The notion is that Israel was supposed to be a country where Jews would take control of their history. They would make history, they would ride the wave of history and control it. But now Israeli Jews, whether rightly or wrongly, feel paralyzed. They feel there is no partner for peace, so they say, whether there is or not. That feeling of helplessness ties into a kind of diasporic Jewish traditional mentality that anti-Semitism is eternal, that the Jews are never truly, they're never at home, and the best one can do is carry on, manage the conflict rather than end it. That the only alternative to constant vigilance, right, is destruction. It really is a dismantling of so much of what classic Zionism was all about, which was about empowerment and agency.
And you can see it reflected in the policies of the present government, especially the policies of the present Prime Minister. Prime Minister Netanyahu is, or appears to be at least, obsessed with security to the exclusion of everything else, including peace. For example, when, during the brief period of direct negotiations, everyone that I've spoken to on the Palestinian side insists that the only thing that the Israelis would talk about was security. They really would not talk about it.
Can you blame them for that?
Yes, you can, because the Palestinians could come in with their own monomaniacal obsessions based on their own traumatic history, which they certainly have. We wouldn't want to get into a comparison of pain, but when you're dealing with two traumatized peoples here, you can certainly forgive them their trauma, but you do have to expect them to overcome it. And I would expect both of them to do that.
We've seen Netanyahu interviewed, though, and he's often asked, don't you want to be the guy who eventually, makes the permanent peace between these two peoples? And you can see him struggling with that because he says, yeah, but I don't want to be the guy who's responsible for Israel's security taking a step backwards.
It's quite interesting, actually. if we're going to psychoanalyze.
That's what we're doing.
Which is what we're doing, and particularly Netanyahu, because in that sense he's very conflicted. He comes, his father was a very, very distinguished scholar, and he had a heroic brother. And so I think, and you see flashes of it very occasionally, where he does want to leave a legacy. And the only legacy you leave in this part of the world is if you make peace. You don't leave a legacy if you make war. That's routine, right? On the other hand, this is first and foremost a politician. And as we all said earlier, he negotiates across his coalition. And Arafat, in a funny way, shared some of those characteristics. For Arafat, the preeminent political imperative was political survival.
Right.
And he negotiated across his constituencies repeatedly and could not take the big step. I think that's very true of Netanyahu as well.
I think that's a great analogy.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, to what extent is this real? I don't want to deny that it's not real. I mean, obviously at some level there is the sort of the psychological issue. But to what extent is it not consciously politically cultivated and manipulated by a political class that sees it in its own self-interest to do so? I'm not quite clear that Netanyahu really believes that, other than the fact, I find it more likely to believe that he thinks that it's to his political advantage to manipulate it. And if it's not him who's doing it, another politician will, so he better get out in front.
But do you not see the struggle, just stand by, do you not see the struggle that Jen has put forward there, which is on the one hand, yes, of course, political survival, but on the other hand, he is a man of some ego, and he would love the history books to be able to record that he was the guy who made it happen. Those things are in conflict, are they not? Well,
they are, except that I also think that he has certain principles and certain commitments. And part of those commitments are this idea of a, for lack of a better term, a biblically rooted Israel. And that includes the land to the west of the Jordan River. And I think he has a commitment to that.
Do you buy that? No, actually, because he's renounced that, and his party renounced that. So this is actually somebody who has some capacity for movement. But let's talk about the Palestinian side for a moment, because they're powerful emotions, and the Palestinian side too.
Yes.
When you talk to Palestinians, it doesn't take long for the conversation to go to justice, and that is a principle, and there's great emotion in the conversation around justice.
Can I play a clip to that end?
Yes.
We got a clip for that. We had
a
quote from Brother Penzler. Now we have a quote from Khalid Rashidi, probably the most prominent Palestinian.
Rashid Khalidi.
Rashid Khalidi.
Right.
I'm in my backward mood today. Palestinian-American intellectual today, and here he is on the issue of dignity. Justice, call it justice, call it dignity. Roll tape, please.
You will realize that there was something else than just a demand for democratic governance or social equality. There was always a demand for dignity, karama, in these revolutions, especially in the Tunisian and the Egyptian revolution, and then that was picked up and spread to the other Arab revolutions. Now, this was a demand for two kinds of dignity. It was a demand in the first place for individual dignity, but it was also a demand for collective dignity. It is here where Palestine in general and Gaza in particular fit in. This has been central to what has been going on in these Arab revolutions. It's not been something that people may have noticed, but in fact, Palestine, the issue of Palestine, in particular the issue of Gaza, was at the center, at the heart of this demand for collective dignity.
Is the prevailing emotion in that part of the Arab world today humiliation?
I think the desire, I wouldn't say humiliation, but what I would say is that the prevailing demand is a demand for dignity, and that it takes many forms, not two forms, many, many forms. And I think it's impossible to overstate the extent to which the collective broader Arab dignity, which is one dimension of a very multifaceted dignity deficit or dignity demand, can't be overstated. Certainly, Palestine is the prism of pain through which most Arabs across national lines, class lines, gender lines, age lines, view international relations.
How come?
Well, because it is a collective Arab trauma. It is not just a defeat, but an enormously painful experience that happened to basically the destruction of an existing thriving Arab society that has not yet fully revived itself. And it has been a tremendous shock to the collective Arab system. Now, I think that the one thing when we're talking about emotions and politics that I'd like to throw in here, whether you're talking about Netanyahu or anybody, any political figure on the Arab side, Muhammad's absolutely right. Politicians say what they think is politically expedient, and also they have values, they have ideologies that they believe in, etc. The two tend to come together. And it is often difficult to prize them apart when the ideology and the rhetoric serves the political interest. And this takes us back to the beginning. We were talking about, can Hamas be moderated? And also, can Netanyahu be induced to be a history-making person? It depends a lot on whether they see it in their political interest to move away from their rhetoric, away from their emotions, and away from their ideology to something different. In other words, they need help.
Mohammed, how do you get past the widespread, pervasive element of humiliation in this part of the world?
Well, I think the popular revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia are a very, very important first step, so people can take charge of their own political destinies. And I think when that happens, a lot of this will be erased. Now, I think it's very important, again, going back to what we were talking about earlier, psychology and such. There has to be, I think, a shift in attitude, both on the sides of Palestinians and Israelis, to recognize this as a common problem and not a single sum or zero sum game.
Are we there yet?
I don't think so, unfortunately. I don't think so, and I think it's easy to blame the Palestinians, but the Palestinians have no power in this game. I think that responsibility primarily lies with the side with the most power. Now, again, if Israelis believe that 48 was about extermination and finishing up the Holocaust, it's very hard to understand how any Israeli would ever make any peace at all. And this is something I tried to tell some friends that I made when I was a college student. They're from Peace Now, and they were always telling me, never talk about 48. Israelis aren't psychologically prepared to talk about 48. Only talk about 67 and beyond. And I said, but that doesn't make sense, because if you're not ready to talk about 48, then you can't reasonably enter into peace with Arabs, because you will think that Arabs have visceral, irrational hatred of you.
One quick follow-up on this, though. You say they have no power, and yet most of the world is on their side.
Well, I guess, sort of being Stalinist here, how many tanks and how many cannons and et cetera, right? And so, this is the irony of it. The Israelis have all the tanks, the guns, and the thermonuclear weapons, but they feel this real sort of legitimacy deficit that could take them down. And this is the problem. You have both sides are sort of equally insecure. One side materially, the other side psychologically.
Let's finish on this then, because we've got about 3 minutes left to go. And let's. This is from Facebook. This is a woman named Susan Wahab, born in Ramallah, now lives in Sydney, Australia, and she has posted this on her Facebook page in response to somebody calling the Israeli Prime Minister a pig. And here's what she wrote. She said, "Please, no bad language. Learn to be assertive and articulate in your communication of your message and Palestinian cause without calling names. Calling Netanyahu pig doesn't diminish him, it reflects on who you are. If you want to liberate Palestine, respect your adversary. Everyone is doing what they know is the best way to secure their position. With all the weaponry the Israelis have, they still feel insecure. Talk to them as human beings, and we can secure peace. The Israelis, as much as we don't like to face, are human, just like us, with good and bad human behaviors." I want to know, Derek, you first, then we'll go around on this. How much longer before we start to see far more Susan Wahabs on both sides of this conflict?
Well, I'm very happy to hear of this. I think there are a lot of people out there. They're often the ones who are afraid to speak up, because the extremists are the ones who speak the most loudly. Israelis are indeed suffering from a surfeit of anxiety. And it might be that the disempowered might feel that they are not in a position, they should not be and are not in a position to have to mollify. But in fact, they are, just as Israelis have to recognize Arab dignity. And just victimization does not automatically bestow virtue. The fact that there are many great many Palestinian victims does not mean that they have lacked agency as well. The recognition of agency then is the precondition for the recognition of dignity on both sides.
I completely agree with that. Suffering is not ennobling. If it was, prisons would be the noblest place in any society, and they're not. Yeah, I mean, Muhammad's right that Israel has the power, but Palestinians also have responsibility. I mean, what they do and do not do will help to shape their future enormously. When will we have more people like this? I think we have plenty on both sides. We collectively have allowed extremists and minority groups that are maximalists to have a veto over the will of majorities, solid majorities of Israelis, Palestinians, Americans, etc., understand that they need the same thing, and this is a win-win
I got to say, 30 for you, 30 for you.
Very, very quickly, the politics in this part of the world, the political institutions are unforgiving. In both societies, you have highly dysfunctional political institutions that make it very difficult for the Susan Wahhabs to have an effective political voice.
I actually think there are plenty of Susan Wahhabs on both sides, but I get back to the unremitting support that the United States gives Israel. I think that shifts Israel's politics radically to the right in a way that's remarkably unhelpful.
My hunch is if we put the four of you in a room, you'd solve this in a day. You'd get a job done. Hussein Ibish from the American Task Force on Palestine, Derek Penzler, the professor of Jewish history at the U of T, Mohammed Fadl, professor of law, U of T, Janice Stein, Monk School, U of T. Thanks so much, everybody. Really appreciate this discussion.